Okay, so the goal of this screencast is to learn how to declare variables in MATLAB. Specifically, we'll start with scalars and then move on to row and column vectors, and then finally we'll cover how to declare matrices in MATLAB. So when you type a is equal to 7 in MATLAB, what you're saying is that take the value 7 and store it in a variable called a. So when you say that, what the computer does is it goes to your memory and it takes some chunk of memory. So it takes, say, this much space in memory. It puts your data inside of it. So in this case, 7 is our data. So it puts the 7 inside of it. Then it creates a variable a. So it creates this part right here after that. So it creates a. And what it does after that is that it has your variable name. Oops. It has your variable name point to the space in memory where you stored your data. So in this case, a points to the space in memory where 7 is stored. Now say you made a mistake, you didn't want to say a is equal to 7, what you really meant to say was a is equal to 56. So what the computer does now is it once again goes into your memory and it occupies a small chunk of memory and it stores a 56 inside of it. So it takes a memory big enough to store your data inside of it. In this case our data is 56, so it puts a 56 inside of it, and then it goes back to a. Since a is already created, it makes a new pathway from a pointing to 56. So now a, instead of pointing to 7, it points to 56. So this new pathway is created. So a points to this new location in memory, and this pathway gets erased. And when this pathway gets erased, what happens is that this chunk of memory that we used earlier gets recycled for future use. So in future, when you declare a new variable and you need memory in space, this memory is available for use. Now let's look at row and column vectors. The general term for row and column vectors is arrays. So you can say an array which is composed of both row and column vectors. Row vectors are specifically of size 1 by n, while column vectors are specifically of size n by 1. And we'll look at examples of both row and column vectors and how they're declared to help you understand them. First, we'll look at row vectors. And to declare row vectors, you would do something similar to what you did to declare scalars. So first you write your variable name. So I'm going to say grades. Then you put an equal sign, is equal to, and then inside brackets you put your elements separated by commas. So this is a key thing to remember for row vectors. When you declare row vectors, you have to use commas to separate your variables. On the other hand, if you don't want to use commas, what you can do is you can just use spaces to separate your numbers. So between 1, 4, 9, 16, and 25, you see how I have spaces. You can just do that. So now let's go back to this example though. So here we say grade is assigned these 5 elements. So what the computer does when you type this in MATLAB is it goes into your memory, takes a chunk of space, and then stores these 5 elements inside of that space. So this is some space in memory, and then you have 90, 98, 87, 76, and 65 stored inside of it. Then it creates a variable called grades. So a variable called grades is created, and then it points to that space in memory where these 5 elements are stored. So this variable points to this space in memory where you store all your variables. Now when you're reading the positions of your elements, this is how we read them. This position right here, 90, is position 1, 1. 98 is position 1, comma 2, 87 is position 1, comma 3, 76 is position 1, comma 4, and 65 is position 1, comma 5. Now let's look at another example. Here we have squares is equal to 1, 4, 9, 16, and 25. Notice how instead of using commas, now I've just used spaces. So this is another way of declaring row vectors. And once again, the computer does the same thing when you type this in MATLAB. It takes some space in memory, and then it stores these 5 elements in there, and then it creates a variable called squares, and then that variable points to that location in memory. Similarly, when you create column vectors, you have a different syntax, but you're essentially doing the same thing. So here we say grades is equal to, once again, the same numbers, except this time you see that instead of separating by commas, we're separating by semicolons. When you use semicolons, what it does is instead of creating this horizontal array, it creates this vertical array. And everything else remains the same. So first it goes to the memory, takes up some space, and then it stores these 5 elements. Then it creates this variable name called grades, and then it creates a pathway where the variable grade points to the location in memory where your data is stored. Another way of declaring column vectors in MATLAB is you first create a row vector, and then at the end you put a prime. So you see this prime right here. You can just put a prime at the end, and you can go from a row vector to a column vector. So here we have squares is equal to 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, closing the bracket, and then you put a prime. So the first thing it does, it goes to the memory, allocates enough space so you can store all these 5 variables, creates this variable name, squares, and then it makes a pathway so that the variable squares points to this location in the memory. Finally, let's talk about matrices. Now that since I've already mentioned scalars, row vectors, and column vectors, I should mention that all scalars are matrices of size 1 by 1, all row vectors are matrices of size 1 by n, and all column vectors are matrices of size n by 1. So scalars, row vectors, and column vectors are essentially matrices. So now, how do you declare matrices in MATLAB? The way you do it is essentially the same way you declared column vectors, row vectors, and scalars. So here you write temp vals is equal to a matrix. So this is a 3 by 5 matrix. It contains 15 elements in total, right here. So the first thing the computer does is it goes into the memory, takes a chunk of space, and it stores these elements inside of it in this order. Then it creates a variable called temp vals, and that variable points to that location in memory where all these 15 variables are stored in one place. Now, when you look at matrices, you have positions. So this position right here is 1, 1. This position right here is 1, 2. This position right here is 1, 3. This position right here is 1, 4. This position right here is 1, 5, and then so forth. So you read rows first and then columns. So you have, in this case, you have 1, 2, 3 rows and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. So this is a 3 by 5 matrix. Another way of declaring a matrix is that you can essentially write this line, the first row, then you can put a semicolon, and then you can continue to write on the same line, and then write this, and then put a semicolon, and then continue to write on the same line and write this. So this is essentially how you declare row and column vectors and then matrices in MATLAB.